Thank you for coming to Why We Need to Go All In on Climate Justice. My name is Heather McRae, and I am the director of the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. We are a fund that pools about $22 million from 3 different foundations to support action on climate justice. I'm curious in this crowd here, how many of you, just raise your hands, if you're really new to the idea of climate justice, if you've come because you really don't know what it is and you're curious, just raise your hand. I have a few hands there. Welcome. We're really excited to have you joining this conversation. Could I also see hands from people who feel like they really understand climate justice and they feel committed to climate justice, that they're part of this movement? Raise your hands. Oh, wonderful. So excited to see that. Finally, could I see hands from people who are with us from the Global South? We would love to give you a special welcome too. Thank you. Thank you for coming all this way. Today, it's my privilege to really pull together a unique conversation on climate justice. At the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, we envision a world where those who are hit hardest by the climate crisis lead the way to a more just and equitable future for everyone. For us, climate justice means centering people, their rights, and their lived experience in the movement for climate action. Today, we've brought 2 formidable climate activists to the stage to talk about this. I'm so excited. Farhana Yamin is an international environmental lawyer, a policy expert, and an advisor to a number of global movements like Extinction Rebellion. She's also the director of a unique initiative called the Climate Justice Just Transition Funders Collaborative. So she has a lot to say about philanthropy. Likewise, Maria Alejandra Escalante is a genderqueer feminist researcher from Colombia. And she's also the Climate Justice Advocacy Officer for FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. They've come together today to share their journeys as activists and to talk about their visions for the future of the climate justice movement and how philanthropy is poised to help. I'm going to get off the stage for a moment here, and we'll have a conversation between these 2 fabulous ladies. It is being filmed. I wanted everyone to know that. And we'll have questions afterwards. So just this microphone will be available for everyone who has questions. But meanwhile, over to you, Farhana and Maria Alejandra.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you hear me well, right? Great. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Heather, Hillary, Elise, everyone, for bringing us here together. Thank you, Farhana, for this conversation. I'd like to give a brief introduction of myself, and then I'll pass it to Farhana. I'm Maria Alejandra, as you've heard. I was born, grew up in Colombia, where I felt since a very young age a strong connection with the land. I come from a campesino family, from a farmer's family in Colombia. And all of this information has brought me to studying climate and environmental justice from many different angles, from an academic point of view, understanding and learning about human ecology, complex human and non-human ecosystems, to climate policy and being able to attend UN climate negotiations as part of youth delegations, as gender rights delegations. And I had a strong lived experience with activism back home and also in the international climate justice space, working together with other leaders, young leaders, to bring about visions for climate justice, especially those that are rooted in the lived experiences of Global South communities who are at the front lines of climate impacts. I have organized different spaces in Colombia, in the region, for not only young leaders, but also Black, indigenous farmers, indigenous people whose visions have been sidelined and marginalized from decision-making spaces. And all of this background has brought me to philanthropy. I've never been on this side of the resources channel, let's say. I was always on the other side as an activist, really scouting for resources, really sort of bending at some point proposals in order to be able to do what we wanted to do collectively. And it was not until I joined FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, that I realized the different dynamics that are going on within philanthropy and that are often not necessarily benefiting or supporting groups on the ground. With FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund, I have been able to not only learn about these dynamics, but also insert a different voice to traditional philanthropy, a voice that is really centered in giving groups on the ground trust, basically, trusting their expertise, trusting that they are on the front lines of change as well as impacts, and really seeding a conversation within traditional philanthropy about the important need of disrupting the power dynamics that we've seen and that we're gonna get to explore in this conversation. So basically, I'm coming here today with all of these different angles, from an academic angle, from a lived experience, from activism, and now from philanthropy to hopefully be able to, dig into what climate justice really means for all of us and what is the expected role of activism and the climate justice movement and those behind them resourcing the movement. So, Farhana.
Well, thank you. Thank you also to all of you for being here and to all of our support teams from abroad. I've always wanted to come to South by, so this is a really important occasion, and especially to call out Tracy, who has been working at South by. Now we have a climate track here, which I understand has been going for 2 years, and I hope next year, Tracy, we give you even more, amazing speakers and ideas to put on the biggest stages and take over South by, because my number one sort of takeaway for you is climate justice and action to transform our current system has to take over the whole world. That is what this panel is about, why we have to go all in. We have lost so much time, and I feel, my hair has gone gray. It used to be Maria Alejandra's color, actually, when I started in the climate negotiations 31 years ago, back in 1991, which is even longer, actually. My maths is all wrong now still. So I've come to that conclusion that we need to have every stage, every panel, every festival, especially the arts, culture, and media sector are really, really important. And in fact, my second contention and takeaway for you is, we need more storytellers than scientists. The scientists have been speaking, and they have not gotten through. They are hugely frustrated. The diplomats, I count myself as one. I've been part of the UN negotiations now, as I said, for more than 30 years, negotiated 3 treaties during that time: the Climate Convention, the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which took another 5 years to enter into force, and then it took a decade essentially to negotiate and put in place the Paris Agreement of 2015. And each time, powerful forces have thwarted those agreements, tried to essentially kill them, and tried to make sure that they weren't implemented. And we have a big job on our hands to tackle the inertia, the vested interests. So we need you all to be activists, and that's what this panel is also about. I guess the thing that Heather didn't mention, and that isn't usually stuff that I write in my bio, is the uncomfortable stuff, which I've felt I have had to use and inspires me. And actually, apart from being this lawyer and this expert and advising sort of ministers, I'm actually a mother. I'm actually a Muslim. I'm actually a migrant. I came to the UK when I was about 9. I never went to a white person's home until I was 18. There is huge systemic racism. I've come later on to understand how deep that is. I think as a young woman, someone who was a first generation university goer, was the first person in my family, apart from my brother and I, went to university in the whole of our generation. Thought actually the system works. Here we are, we've got our education, Pakistani family, education, education, education. And I wanted to use that law, use my profession, use my agency within the legal world to put that at the service. In my case, I supported small and vulnerable countries in the climate negotiations since 1991. And I thought that was enough. I thought that, armed with law, with the best science, we are now on the 6th science report, as you know, from the UN panel. It comes out roughly every 5 years, 5 to 6 years. So we're on the 6th round of that report. And even today, the emissions are rising and rising and rising. So my story, which we're going to explore a little bit through questions, is this intergenerational story of a little bit of someone looking back at the last 30 years and also looking forward to what's to come, and how the older climate and environment movements need actually the eyes, ears, energies, and concepts that the younger generations are providing. So I think that's what we're going to try and do today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, and I guess, we've already mentioned a little bit of what brought us to where we are, to the activism that we've done, and to that principle that we have been in search for, which is justice and equity. I wonder if you want to add anything to that path that you've mentioned. Maybe I'll add a few things after you.
Well, I guess to elaborate, my life story, good girl, saw my route out of, being married off at a very early age, at the age of, 18, right? Let's thwart that by going to uni, play the uni card. Yeah. So that went down well, avoided marriage for a few years. And then I married, on my own terms. I actually married someone who's Jewish. So we had then 4 children who call themselves Jislims and are very much activists in their own right. And I spent then the time in my 20s essentially juggling family and juggling a big career, a big international career, which required me to be away often, traveling 2-3 months of the year. And those were the years in which we were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol. So in 1997, I traveled literally for 3 months and had 2 small children who probably are, this is all material that they used to sue me later on probably for parental neglect. So there's a lot of sacrifices that have been made by people like me, by many others, to create the international fabric, to create the laws, to create the legislation on which we're now standing and taking forward. And I guess, we carried on trying to get targets, get them legally binding, get them aligned to science, get justice and equity, always make sure that the vulnerable communities and vulnerable people were represented in all of these really complex, arcane, difficult negotiations, but they always had the benefit of the best legal advice, the best scientific advice, the best support from civil society, the best campaigns. And I guess, moving quickly forward to 2016, when we had the election of President Trump, that for me was, that was something, a shock I could not actually recover from. I just felt I couldn't carry on in the face of that. I was finding, I was burnt out, I was truly exhausted. I didn't want to spend another, 4 or 8 years under a Trump presidency, which was going to dismantle everything, He was going to dismantle it from day one, and then he did start from day one, literally. As you all know, he tried to, he withdrew from Paris, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. And I felt that's what really turned me into a place of reflection, very deep sadness and reflection, and I felt I'd failed. I literally felt personally I'd failed. And I felt very much, I read a lot about social movements. I did a one-year course on nature connection. I was this lawyer defending nature, but never spent any time in it. I was always in a room in a UN building or at my laptop. And that really revived me, and it gave me a sense of courage and hope, being with people who were, likewise prioritizing well-being, connection with nature, actually bonding and healing in nature. And I guess I also then met a bunch of activists who introduced me to Extinction Rebellion, which was being started up around 2018, and all of them felt as equally frustrated with the environment movement and with what happened on climate, and said, actually, all these other movements, like the anti-apartheid movement, the gay rights movement, the women's movement, land rights, all of these had used nonviolent direct action much, much more than they had used. They had also used advocacy petitions and so forth. So that's what brought me to the point where I felt like someone like me, who had been, I guess, an establishment sort of person by this stage, had built up their career, was needed. And what better person to break the law than a lawyer to say, actually, the legal route isn't sufficient. So I helped organize some of the political strategy work for Extinction Rebellion. By that time, I'd also worked in philanthropy for a number of years, and they needed funding. So this is a real message to funders and foundations. They really need to, diversify who they see as leaders and what kind of action is needed, and they need to fund frontline groups that are willing to take risky actions and don't have a nice, neat, KPI sort of diagram saying, here's what we're going to do, and it's going to lead to this. So revolutions are kind of messy. And that's what's brought me to here, to you, to Southwest, actually, because I feel if I hadn't done that, I would still be writing articles urging governments to act. And they're not reading. The people in power are not reading a thing. We have given them so much evidence. They are waiting to see what we do on the streets, what we do in our lives, what we do in our jobs, how we change our own behaviors in terms of consumption, and also what we vote for.
Thank you. I guess I love to underline how interconnected our identities are with the type of activism and with the search for justice that we have done. I think on my side, things that I love to mention too is that growing up in Colombia, as many of you probably know, has been a constant shock about the type of violence that pervades society. We have been in a civil war for 60 years, and none of us in Colombia are exempted from looking at communities, brown communities, indigenous people, from being displaced from their territories, right? From being in the constant lookout to save their lives, to save their means of production, to save their livelihoods. And growing up in that scenario to me was extremely important because I got to see firsthand what a corporate, extractivist, and neoliberal government does to people, which is putting profit before people, right? Putting profit before the health and the well-being of ecosystems. And I was enraged, right? And I think that I want to highlight how feelings like rage and sadness and frustration are part of the movement, are part of the action that has brought me to where we are right now. I was also really moved by the fact that these same communities are the ones also still holding up, are still looking for alternatives, are still, with the little that they got, they're still driving alternatives to these types of displacement, pollution, corruption, this lack of power, basically. And I was inspired by this power, this invisible power of these communities. So I appreciate what you say in terms of your religious background, your family background, because I think all of that informs who we are, and all of that is embedded within the work that we're doing. Another big aspect of myself is my genderqueer identity and how that has played out within the movement when I began attending different UN spaces and being on that other side of the policy work, which is more like, how do we translate this complex vocabulary of policy work to the outside world? And us being the youth movement, the youth leaders in that space, we really tried to translate. We were translators of that policy making. And we put together different actions, protests, nonviolent direct actions, which I have been also part of. But in general, I felt that back then, 10 years ago or so, the climate movement was extremely white in the sense of operating, but also in the sense of leadership and who got to speak, who had the agency to speak, who had the vision, and also the type of actions and strategies that were being proposed by the movement there didn't necessarily involve global majority vision, right? It was still very centered in a competition, in the spotlight, in the speaker, in those like really sort of formal, rational tactics that leave behind everything that the movement was still needing, which is also like a moment to sit down and a moment to grieve and a moment to be together and a moment to create and imagine. And I believe that my gender queerness aspect became really important to me in that space, because I realized that, wow, if the climate justice movement is still having like these traits of patriarchy in it, how worrisome can that be, right? Like if we're putting all of our bets in the movement, but still the movement is still being patriarchal, there's still traces of racism within it, what do we do, right? And to me, the power of organizing with other queer people, gender non-binary people, trans people, is that these communities, collectives, individuals have the power and have the knowledge to reinvent the binary thinking between rationality and emotion, between north versus south, right? And obviously, and to me it has been really evident, that binary division between humans and non-humans, right? The whole notion that comes from a colonial past of how humans are there to be the owners of what surrounds us. So yeah, I love how we can be merging and threading our different identities in that search for justice, because I think that justice and equity pervades and can be seen and can be pursued from anywhere, basically.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, so this is an unscripted conversation. We've got some questions, but I just want to say how in awe I am of, Maria Alejandra's work and the work of the LGBT community, the work of Black Lives Matter, and the work. Why is that work important? It's because, by and large, the environment movement and the climate movement were operating at the level of sort of policies and kind of, quite high-level programs, policies, what legislation do we change, and very much focused on what we call mitigation, like preventing bad gases from the atmosphere. Very technocratic, too. And I think we really missed out and did not connect the systemic issues about how the whole economy works. We said, yes, climate is the biggest problem in the world, but then we actually just proposed very tiny incremental policy tweaks. Oh yeah, let's put in a carbon tax. Oh, let's have offsets. Now I sort of say it like that, but actually I was part of that entire way of thinking in some ways, and that's also my experience. Philanthropy also supported that. It did not fund those who were, challenging at a more radical level, at a deeper level, I should say, a much deeper level, the system itself that was producing the effect. We were very focused on the symptoms, and it was like sticking plasters, really, when you look back on it. And that's where I feel that the movements like Black Lives Matter, those who have been challenging patriarchy, challenging white supremacy, challenging colonialism, have really made us see how enormously powerful and entrenched, these forces are, and we're seeing that now very visibly as a result of 2 years of COVID and lockdown. Who really is vulnerable? How does the global economy work? Who gets, vaccines is the same set of people who get the oil first, whose electricity supplies don't run out, who don't get invaded by and large, who are in secure places where conflict has been outsourced and takes place somewhere else so that we can carry on and our supply chains are not disrupted. And I feel that this much more profound look at systemic issues of changing the entire system that has brought all of us to this ecological tipping points, but also social tipping points, also is, frankly, repressing and stopping the opportunities for flourishing of the vast majority of the world, which is women, indigenous people, non-binary people, those with disabilities. Actually, we're the majority of the world's people, and the paradigm, why is that? It's because the DNA of this kind of capitalism was established, like 400 years ago, when all of those categories didn't exist legally. We didn't count. And I feel this where the work of linking bodies, an embodied full approach, linking land, are really, really inspiring and a much needed corrective to the more, I regard now as more superficial stuff. It's great, we should all have insiders working away on carbon taxes, but listen, I've been working on carbon taxes for 30 years and they have not worked, and they will simply result in some shifts, but not shifts that will really bring about justice, of equality. And fighting for more eco-ness in an unjust world is not what I want to do. So I feel like it's really heartening to see how Maria Alejandra and around the world and the activists that you're supporting. So maybe you could say a little bit about the work. I understand you're supporting about 200 activists and organizations around the world through FRIDA. They're making a difference, and we're right here with you to help you do that. It'd be great to share some of their work.
And I agree that the climate justice movement has shifted and evolved, and obviously it's not a static movement. And I am pleased to see that over the past decade that I have been very active in the movement, it has changed, and it has those shades of complexity. It has that analysis of the systemic structures that are cut across all of our living experience, and that are absolutely important for the type of transformational climate work that we want to do, right? Like, without shifting the economic inequalities, we cannot think about climate solutions that are deep, that are real, that are structural, that are long-lasting. And I think, if anything, like I also want to congratulate and appreciate all of our work, all of the work that older generations have done to get us to this place, to get us to a place where we talk about systemic structures of oppression and the need to stand on that analysis to be able to root the changes that we really want. And I feel that we wouldn't be here without everything that has happened, right? Without the nitty-gritty policy work that used to happen, 1980, 1990. So I want to thread that sort of lesson that I see from the movement and from its evolution. And yes, I think that something that has been really powerful around the world, especially in the region that I come from, is the ecofeminist movement. Because what ecofeminists are telling us is that, yes, these are systems that have been rooted since a colonial time, but that can be uprooted as well. That we can heal from them, but that we as communities have the power to evolve and have the power to break away from those systems of oppression. And it is now that we're just probably exhausted about exhausted about being displaced, exhausted about a non-healthy living situation, exhausted about being oppressed by those who do not understand the realities of territories. And to me, the power of ecofeminist movements is not only about this also sort of stereotypical notion of the female is more drawn to the connection with land and nature, but actually it's a political work of saying these territories are life and we protect life, right? And this is what we really try to do at FRIDA, the Young Feminist Fund. FRIDA is a global fund that resources young feminist groups and activists that are emerging, that haven't had the chance to apply or receive large amounts of funding. And at FRIDA, those 200 groups, 200 and something groups, are receiving core and flexible funding to carry on their types of visions of the world. These are groups that are working towards gender rights, gender equality, gender equity from different angles, from arts, from education, from breaking away from gender violence, but also from that ecofeminist point of view. And these are groups that are located, what I find like most fascinating about my work is that those groups are located in all different regions, but all of them thread messages, right? Of like, we protect our lives, and we want to get rid of those systems that pollute not only our bodies, but our minds, our imaginations, our political work. And I find it fascinating that these people are young leaders, right? That is just, these are young people starting from like girls 12 to 18 to 30 years old, people who have their whole life to keep on imagining a different world. So what would a different world look like if these people were at the decision-making table, right? And I think that's the bet that FRIDA wants to do. We're right now trying to resource a better future for all.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm ready to hand over and help. I feel like I'm a process nerd. You know, that's one of my superpowers. I mean, something that you said touched me. So a few years ago, as you know, well, based on all this inertia, there was this outpouring of activism, you know, from Fridays for Future, which Greta helped start, from Extinction Rebellion to here in the US, you had the Sunrise Movement, you had the Green New Deal, you had, you know, you wouldn't have the president you have now without all of that activism, especially here in this country. Yeah. You had, a lot of that work was led by Black and brown people, actually, and indigenous groups in this country, but elsewhere too. And part of me was so thrilled and relieved, and my own children, two of them are at the Gen Z, and the top two are millennials. They were all active in different ways, but especially the younger two were out on the streets and marching, and you know, like, no, you cannot have another day off school. You know, part of me as mum, but part of me was really supporting them. But part of me was really upset, you know, at the early, for example, things which both XR and Greta Thunberg said, you know, like, you've done nothing, you know, what have you been doing? Nothing's happened, absolutely nothing's happened. And it really hurt me on a personal level, but it also, I think, damaged the movement. There was this generational, you know, vitriol, you know, and I feel that actually we're a slightly different place now. There was, you know, almost like blaming, you know, a generation above for everything that had gone wrong. And I felt, oh, well, that's not cool. That's also very personalized. You know, no one has a choice about where or who they're born or where they're born. That's not a decision you're responsible for. And that's not to say that the baby boomers, which I'm not quite a baby boomer, slightly under that level, but you know, that generation has benefited. If you're in the UK, in the Western world, that generation has had the best in terms of security, in terms of well-being, you know, GDP growth and all the rest of it, but it's been at the expense of the rest of the world and of future generations and younger groups, for example, and the global south. So I feel like actually there is now a better dialogue, and today's conversation is very much part of what we're trying to do, to have a healthier, respectful dialogue between all of us, because another one of the binaries that's being pitted is young people against old people, black people against white people, lower class people against middle class people. All of these divisions are fomented and used by opponents to divide actually us. And I think what's really healthy and has happened, you know, Greta herself, I think, has led the way in trying to give platform and voice to everyone around the world, and also now understanding that, you know, imperfect though it is, you know, actually, you know, national legislation, it doesn't take a year, it takes 5 years, 10 years, and it's really easy to knock it, but it's much harder to get it on the books. And once it's there, it needs improving, it needs completing, it needs to be aligned and connected up, and it needs funding, you know, whether it's the Treasury here or the Treasury in the UK. And we see that in the UK. So right now, right in the middle of this war, we have a new campaign to get rid of net zero by 2050 as a target in the UK. The UK was one of the first countries after the Extinction Rebellion protests to legislate a legally binding goal of net zero emissions by 2050. So you may have, you know, your doubts about this concept, but actually it was a really powerful, progressive move intended to impose legal limits and 5-year legal pathways to that. It wasn't just a long-term target, it's 5-yearly increments towards that target. And so you're seeing attacks, and I feel like one of the things that the younger movement, I guess, the newer movements, people who are just joining, you know, we need to have that conversation. How do we safeguard and bank the gains that we've made and improve them? And how do we also go forward at that more systemic level as well? And how do we imagine what that process looks like, and how do we imagine what we want to create together? So I'd love to know how your imaginaries and your processes are for doing that. Yeah.
I think something that pops up here is the recognition and the honoring in what you've said in many different ways. Because on one hand, when you speak about breaking away from those divisions, right? Breaking away from being isolated, from being South versus North, I feel that right now, what we're doing now is a representation of what is happening at the movement level, which is honoring that the climate justice movement has a history, right? That it was not Greta Thunberg that started it, right? As we've said. And that thanks to that history of resistance and resilience of the global majority is that we have language and that we have evidence that community building, that community-centered strategies work to transform systems, right? That, as you were saying, that those revolutions that we're seeking are also based in the collective, are not about the individual, are not about the ego media figure, but are deeply rooted in movement building. And I feel that by recognizing that and by honoring the history that has brought us here, we're healing as well. We're healing from our own divides, right? And this is also bringing me to the loss and damage work that has been going on at the UN policy level, but that is deeply rooted in the movement, because what is loss and damage is sitting with the grief of everything that has already died, basically, because of the crisis that we're in, because of the political, economic crisis that we're in, and it's giving space to that loss, it's giving space to that grieving. And I think that when we talk about the care part and the healing part of our movements, the recognition of what has been lost and the recognition that what has been lost brings us absolute grief and absolute sadness and absolute pain is part of the movement, right? And it's part of that feminist understanding that we're just not robots, right? That are operating from a rational perspective, but that we're grieving away the passing of our elder generations and a future that is uncertain, a future that we don't know how it's going to look like right now, right? So I love that we can bring those different emotions to be embodied in the fight, in the struggle. And when we talk about the future and how do we imagine the climate justice future, I want us to also go into what do we imagine by a feminist, eco-feminist, intersectional movement. And how are we seeing that now, right? So I'd love for us to explore some of that with what we got. I don't know if you want to go ahead. I can obviously jump in.
Jump in.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so this ecofeminist imagination that I have in mind is one where activists and community members are not burned out, for example, right? I feel that we've shared it before, but burnout and depression and anxiety and grief is something that we have experienced, I have experienced, and it's something that is very tangible in the movement, in activism, because we are trying to do, for many reasons. One of the reasons is because we're trying to do so many things at the same time, right? We're trying to have a life, go study, be happy, find joy, but at the same time work towards systemic change, confront the daily basis of violence and conflict, and at the same time find resources to do that, right? So I love to see an ecofeminist movement that is not burnout, that is actually putting well-being and health both at the self and the individual, but also at the community level. And that happens when a movement is resourced on many levels. I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about capacity. I'm talking about support. I'm talking about visibility. And I'm talking about solidarity, international solidarity. So when you speak about the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion, I congratulate those groups or those chapters that have said, hey, we want to give the space to communities of the South, brown communities that have, and show solidarity in that way, right? And I want to explore what solidarity means also for all of us, right? For philanthropy. And hopefully we can jump into philanthropy remaking in a second, but that's part of my ecofeminist imagination. Who gets to, or those who get to imagine a different future, I want to see those people at the center and those people really being healthy and really being supported and really being, given the platforms, the platforms of decision-making places to imagine that future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's an amazing and really important role for funders, for philanthropy, but for everyone to understand, especially what is going on in the global South. I know that's a massive area and billions of people that I'm speaking for, and I step into that and speak for that because right around the world right now, the global South is experiencing terrifying impacts on top of economies that are ravaged, and you know, the wildfires, the typhoons, the extractivism, forest burning, desertification. I could go on and on, especially huge water shortages that are hitting already severely drought-impacted parts of the world. So the whole of that belt in North Africa, Yemen, Syria, these areas are desiccating with huge numbers of people. The world's population is on the move. So the way we now look at migration, refugees, places of safety, these are linked. And our policing and our sense of what is national security needs to change. So for me personally, linking up now, you know, the climate movement with the movement to secure safety for humanity is a very different thing than just looking at, you know, cutting tailpipe emissions from power plants. Yes, we have to stop the infrastructure of the fossil fuel industry. Yes, we have to stop the financing of that infrastructure. But we also have to remember that people are on the front line in every jurisdiction, every country, every small island that I'm, you know, connected to. They are asking for just recognition that that is their reality. And sometimes in international policy and in philanthropy and in the movement, there is not even that acknowledgement of what is really the reality for people. They just want acknowledgement. When you don't accept what is actually happening, it's another form of injustice. It's actually a much bigger injustice. It's like pretending that their life is sort of carrying on as normal is really not the case. So I think this demand, especially as the international work that I do, came to a really big head at the big UN conference in Glasgow in November just a few months ago around this phrase, loss and damage. And the biggest, political motivation driving that is an acknowledgement of the harm that has already happened, and that is happening day after day after day after day, and it will not stop. It will not stop. It can get worse if we now still don't cut back emissions. It can get multiplied tenfold, and hopefully that I'm more confident about, because now we do have renewables, we do have amazing designers. Many of them were here. I was in a session yesterday in the design, construction, building industry. We have the ability to make beautiful living spaces, cities, building sectors, transport. We can get rid of all the pollution tomorrow if we had the political will. So there's something very important in what you said about the acknowledgement of what is going on and having a reparations mentality. And that isn't financial reparations first and foremost. The word reparation means repair. That's what it means. There's a repair. And first of all, acknowledge that something needs to be repaired, something's broken. And I felt that's what underlying not just Extinction Rebellion, but what the new movements were asking for was the tell the truth. That was the first demand by XR, actually. It was tell the truth as it is, like what is really happening. Stop. Sometimes even I find it very difficult to be on that optimistic sort of thing. I can't be there all the time in that optimistic thing when I feel that actually I am optimistic about, and the love and the joy and my solidarity is there, but it's not based on this, everything's going to be kind of all right. We've got all this, because it's really not for a lot of people. I guess I did want to add that sometimes it's difficult to know how we're going to imagine this future together, and that's why we're sort of saying, keep joining the conversation, keep linking with others, and value them. And it isn't a sort of checklist of identities. I must go and talk to a brown person or a black activist or something.
Yep.
Because how can I express it? Sometimes my identity as a Muslim, as a mother, as a woman of color, as a migrant, sometimes they're like coats. They're not me. They're things, they're labels, and that constrain me. And with certain people, I can take those coats off. I don't have to be a woman. I can just be me. I don't have to be a brown person. I can just be me. I can take that coat of racialization. Is a process that happens to me against my will. It's not me. I'm just like you. So I want sometimes to adopt metaphors, spaces where we can, all of us, take off the identities that we're boxed into and feel like we're born into them. And we're not, and that's, again, the tremendous, I did philosophy, so the epistemological work that is done by the queer movement, by those with disabilities, by ecofeminists like yourselves, is tremendous. It's getting rid of all of these categories that we kind of thought were natural, and we have to live in them. We don't have to live in the bodies that we can just live in bodies. We don't have to define them from birth, and get a certificate. Literally, your birth certificate, which most countries require you to have by the age of 30 days with your name and your sex, is boxing you in for life into a set of constructs, a set of norms that you can't get out of. So slightly rambling end of thing, but I feel like actually we need to find metaphors and spaces where we connect as human beings without or as little of that baggage as possible. And that will help us, I think, build bridges, build alliances that are really going to help us, collectively push for justice. And climate justice is, at the end of the day, a part, you can see it as the umbrella, or you can see it as one aspect of gender justice, of land justice, of indigenous people's justice, of disabled justice, of all of the justices together. So it's very, very linked. We're coming up, I think, for the time when it's questions and answers, but maybe you want to respond or turn it over to Heather as you wish.
I mean, Heather, I know you have the mic in your hand. I wonder if you want to, like, maybe with some of the questions we can keep on building. We have time to build on certain points.
Yeah, I'd just like to invite people with questions to come up to this microphone back there. And while people are moving, maybe Maria Alejandra, you can respond to what Farhana just raised for a moment. Great, we've got quite a few people with questions. Terrific.
Yeah, thank you for the questions being prepared. I'm excited for them. Farhana, I just want to say that all of what you're saying in terms of getting rid of those boxes reminds me of two things, and I'll address just one. One of them is, to me, climate justice has meant a spiritual search, because what we're facing right now is the loss of everything that we've known as living on Earth, right? And it's deep, and it's painful, and it goes beyond those structural social identities, cultural ideologies that we've built around society. And to me, it's a question of like, wow, what am I losing as a human being? What is my fellow human being losing? And what is also the future of the other living species that we share this planet with, right? And to me, the exploration of a deep ecology vision has allowed me to see like, oof, this is painful, and this is also part of change, and this is part of a cycle that can obviously be avoided to avoid pain and destruction, but it's also maybe something that we need to start accepting, right? And I think that drives me to different spaces of movement building that go beyond just the face and the body that I embody, basically. So I just want to leave that and just say that the boxes talk to me a lot about philanthropy, and I want to address philanthropy at some point. Hopefully those questions come in.
Yeah. Why don't we take 3 questions to start with, and then you can respond to them as a group.
Wonderful. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. Jenny Hoffner, I'm with American Rivers, a US-based group working on ensuring that all people have clean water and healthy rivers in the context of climate change and all the injustices that exist here. I so appreciate your acknowledgement of all the interconnections and also the need to expand the climate track to encompass more of what we're hearing here at South by. One thing that I wanted to just hear more about from you, in order to sort of address the interconnection of all the harms and the scale of the issues that we're really facing, do you feel that we have the movement infrastructure in place in order to be able to see the changes that we need to see with the urgency that we need to see them? Do you feel like the movement infrastructure is in place and we just need to connect to it? And if so, how? And if not, what do you think are sort of the key things that are needed in order to make that happen, to create that infrastructure that we can all connect to? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, I was at COP26 in Glasgow, and it was really stark to me, especially because of COVID precautions, how separated the outside and the youth and the people representing indigenous communities were from actual negotiations, even more than the previous COP. And so I'm just wondering, as a process nerd, self-proclaimed, like, how do you in the climate justice movement, we use that process and start bridging those two very different leadership structures and movements?
I want to thank you so much for bringing this very rich conversation here today. I hope this message will reverberate outside of this room. I want to ask you about philanthropy and the comment that Maria made about who's coming to the table. When do you see a possibility of the table actually being set by the Black and brown people of this world who are the most affected? That's my question.
Hi, Hagarawayak, Nuninian Fawn. My name is Fawn Douglas. My comment was just on the eco-feminist imagination, and I'm really happy that you brought up so many amazing points, and I think they align very much with my talk for tomorrow about indigenous futurisms, because that's just what it is. And even thinking about I didn't think about that with Greta and just the youth and the elders, the division, and saying you have done nothing. And I thought that was such an important point, because with indigenous futurisms, or the way that we live, we respect our elders, and we have this intergenerational way that we move together as one. So I just wanted to thank you both for your words, and thank you.
So Farhana and Maria Alejandra, we have about 5 minutes. Go for it.
I'll try and remember them all. But so what's missing in the infrastructure is a lot of connectivity, and that isn't easy because funders often like to fund a specific thing, and things get siloed. And so actually, what you need is the stuff that brings stuff out of the silos, and you bring and fund gateway and weavers and connectors, and it's always really hard to then say what your role was because it looks difficult. The other big gap is, broadly speaking, funding for the global south. It is an approximate figure. 2% of all philanthropy globally goes to climate change, which is really, really small. So much more goes to arts and animal welfare, for example, which is, I'm not knocking, I'm saying the philanthropy needs to increase. And in general, nearly all of that 2% goes to North America and Europe. So the work that I'm doing and Heather is involved in is trying to shift as much money and raise more money to the global south. And then the other infrastructure that's missing is for smaller local community organizations to access that funding. So often the funding flows to organizations that have bank accounts and that have infrastructure and can pass due diligence. So even in the global south, it will go to a think tank or a university rather than to the community groups that FRIDA, for example, is working with, or I would like to work with. So that's part of the work that I'm trying to do right now, is to move that forward. So I want to ask, here, what can all of you do? You're all connected and storytellers, and go out and speak. There's sort of 50 people here, lots more watching online who will watch online, but we need to tell these stories. We need to support the activists. We need to support those communities and help them, with the sort of next chapter. So I'll let you have a few more minutes.
Thank you for all the questions. Thank you so much for your comment and for being here, and I'll be there tomorrow. Do we have the infrastructure needed to take on the type of transformations that are so urgent right now? I don't think so. I think the movement is clearly under-resourced, right? It's so small compared to the types of multidimensional, multi-sectoral type of changes that we need to see in the coming decade, right? And that you can see that very easily because we often get burned out. If we were so many, in so many countries, in so many sectors, at so many levels, it wouldn't happen, right? And coming from that activist background, it's so hard. It's so hard to be believed in the work that we're doing, because traditional climate philanthropy wants to see technical fixes, wants to see quantity, wants to see immediate resources. How do we measure an ecofeminist imaginative project, right? That will take maybe a couple of decades to be shaped, right? But if we don't start looking at the million different things that compose the climate activism and climate justice movement, then we're losing time, basically. We're losing essential time to see that just climate activism is not just about protesting. It's not about just policy work. It's deep healing, it's deep imagination, it's deep movement building, it's deep storytelling, it's organizing, it's knocking doors, it's political work, it's political leadership. And do we have a table? No, we don't have a table, because not necessarily only in philanthropy, but also in political spaces, in decision-making spaces. We don't have a table for those who have been at the margins to get to decide, because we're still living in a capitalist, absolutely unequal, racist world in which wealth has been accumulated by expropriation and exploitation of land. Until we don't flip that around, until we don't encourage and resource those at the front lines, those black, brown communities around the world, then it's going to be really hard to access those decision-making spaces, and all of us are implied in doing that work, from media to political leadership to philanthropy to, yeah, all the aspects of society. And just to close, I want to highlight the work that we're doing at FRIDA, not because it's the place where I work, but because we're really trying to steer up traditional philanthropy as much as the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. We're trying to say those people at the front lines have the expertise, and they need core and flexible funding all the way through. They need the resources to bring about that world where different worlds fit, as the Zapatistas movement are saying. And we need resources for that. So we need philanthropy, and we need funders that are willing to pair up and be real allies of that movement.
Well, thank you so much. I hate to be the one to bring this conversation to a close.
One more question.
Let
One
me
last
say,
question. I think there's one more question.
okay, we'll take one more question.
The first thing that I wanted to say, my name is Ryan Paracha. You may recognize Paracha as a Pakistani last name. My father is Pakistani Muslim, and my mother is Ashkenazi Jewish. And in my entire life, I have never met anybody outside of myself and my 3 siblings who has a similar background as me, so that was absolutely incredible to hear. Also one of 4 children. And the question that I had was, you touched on this just a moment ago, but I'm an animator and a designer, and what you said about needing more storytellers really resonated with me. So I was just curious if you had anything more you would be able to say about that.
Well, as a fellow Muslim, you know, we can have a chat later, but I feel here, look, I've come thousands of miles, emitted all this carbon getting here, and it's because South by has filmmakers, it has media, it has musicians, it has AI people, it has all the, you know, forefront of thinking in so many disciplines, and all of them have to ask themselves, how can I be a climate activist? How can I support what is needed? And I don't know the answer to that for all of you, but you have to ask, what is my sector doing? What is my company doing? What is my, you know, what are my peers doing? And what can I do? That's the most important question that I feel everyone can ask themselves. What can I do? Because we can all do things. And I think, you know, we've emphasized the role of philanthropy because the world is full of really wealthy people, and they know, actually, they are really, loads of them are now desperate to give some of it away, and they are giving money away. But at the same time, there's a really important part of me that knows that revolutions are not funded by philanthropists. So everyone has to bring their own gifts, their own resources, and use the resources to make a new world, to shape a new world. Philanthropy can help, funders can help, but the people who can help most is all of us, individually, collectively, organizing ourselves through our families, our clans, our networks, and our work. So yeah, find the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We're over time here, but I just really wanted to thank Farhana and Maria Alejandra for all of their commitment and their work and for sharing their stories so openly here today. And thank all of you for coming. Both our speakers and our CJRF team will be here for the next few days, and come find us if you want to keep the conversation going.